In my interview today, I'm talking with Reverend Rob Schenck. He's the author of Costly Grace. He is the subject of Emmy-winning documentary Armor of Light, and he is an evangelical leader who I think will tell you himself has a very dark past in his role against abortion and gay rights and what that meant to be an evangelical far-right activist. He has since severely changed the course of his life and the work he does within the evangelical movement and what that means socially and politically, and where we are as a country today, and how he now sees things drastically differently. I think it's an important story. I know it's an important story, and it's one that I hope you all watch to the very end, because this is an arc that is not easy to tell, especially when it is your story. So I hope you watch this interview. I really want to hear all your thoughts on this, and enjoy. Rob, thank you so much for being here today and for having this conversation with me. I'm really excited to talk with you and to have people hear your story. I think it's an incredibly unique story, and I'm excited to dive in. But why don't we first have you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm learning that being a minister is not the most important thing about my life. I thought that for a lot of years. So I like to say I'm a member of the human family. I'm in love with the same person I fell in love with 45 years ago. We married 43 years ago, Cheryl. She's my best friend, life partner. I'm a father of two independent adults now. I'm soon to be a grandfather.
Wow.
And
Congratulations.
thank you. I also happen to be an evangelical minister. Was a certain kind of activist, now a different kind of activist. And I hang out a lot with this guy behind me, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, young, brilliant church leader in Germany during the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, paid for his resistance to tyranny with his life. But he left us a whole lot of volumes, which are behind my other shoulder. And I direct what's called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which aims at helping to shape ethically courageous leadership for our own times. So that's kind of who I am in a nutshell.
All right. I think one of the most interesting things about you that really stuck out to me is your later in life pivot. And I think it's hard for people to kind of reflect and come from a point of inflection where they're seeing themselves from the outside. It's very hard to do, especially when you do that later in life. And I think you've done that successfully. And I think that's humble. And I think there's a lot of honesty and vulnerability in the way you live your life. And to me, that's the lesson I really want people to hear about. And I want people to also know the dirty part of that, right? The part of your past where there was pain that you might have caused or been privy to that. So just to start, I want people to kind of hear a verbal arc of your life, and you can interject if I get this wrong, but you grew up nominally Jewish, which I believe was on your mother's side. Became father's side. Sorry. Okay. Became a born again Christian. Then a religious right activist, which I know we're going to get into a lot of that. And then spent 25 years on Capitol Hill and working, basically rubbing theological elbows with presidents, members of Congress, movers and shakers there, court justices, and everything in between. You've founded a lot of religious nonprofits. You're the founding pastor of what's become the largest evangelical congregation in the DC area. Had a later in life epiphany on some of that religious right movement that you were a part of. And then life started to turn and churn in a different direction. You became a part of an Emmy-winning documentary. You published a book and started the Dietrich Bonhoeffer organization. And now, and that's kind of like, right, I want to tell that arc because I think it's very unique. so there's a lot to unpack there, right? And this is, I do this a lot now, and I think this is one of the hardest interviews to structure because of this almost like 6-part movie act, I think, that your life has become, right? Um, but I would like to start by what how do you go from born again Christian um, to being involved with the religious right? Like what is that path? How do you go from there to there?
Yeah, well, that's at once simple and very complex. You know, when I had what I call my first conversion, which was from that nominally Jewish, really cultural religion, rather than, a deeply spiritual, uh, nature to that. It was cultural. And when I had my first conversion, it was very dramatic. It was deeply emotional, very personal, and transformational for me. And what I saw initially was a Jesus who was concerned about the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. He extolled peacemaking, and back in those days, I had actually marched as a young teenager in anti-Vietnam War marches, and I found that very appealing about this Christ figure. And that's what I embraced. Then, years later, when I took my seat at the table of national church leadership, I was invited to a convention of the National Association of Evangelicals, and Ronald Reagan was the first sitting president to address a body of evangelical clergy. By then, I had been to what we call Bible college. I had been ordained. I was serving as a pastor. And there was something about the magic of sitting in the presence of a president of the United States who was embracing us.
Hmm.
And really, evangelicals are a funny study because while we are now one of the largest and most influential religious groups in the United States, arguably in the world, we still have a feeling of being sort of the church on the wrong side of the railroad tracks.
Hmm.
Evangelicalism for,
Is that now or is that during the Reagan era?
well, it was certainly pronounced during the Reagan era. It's less now than it was then, or even 50 or 100 years ago. But there was a kind of feeling that people look down their noses at evangelicals. We're not as well educated. We don't belong to prestigious country clubs, even though that has all changed. Now you go into a city, the largest church, the wealthiest church, the most influential church is probably the evangelical church. And that pastor may belong to the most, uh, expensive country club, might have a private jet at generally his disposal. So, it has changed, but the mentality, at least back when I was in leadership, was, we're the lesser sort religiously. And so to have this celebrated president embrace us, there was a presidential aura, and it was very seductive.
Yep.
And then, of course, it became a transactional relationship. Reagan said in less grotesque fashion than Trump has said today, listen, you give me what I need, I'll give you what you want. And that became the agreement that I eventually became part of.
And what is that pact? What was asked of and what was known that would have to be provided back?
Well, for Reagan, similar now with Trump and with previous Republican presidents, first was to embrace the party. Back when I first became an evangelical, most evangelicals I knew were Democrats.
Yeah.
Then suddenly, everyone started switching party uh, membership. I did because I was asked to. And then we were assured that the Republican Party was the party that would embrace evangelical values. And so abortion, what I can only call what was called family values, but I think at that time equated to basically anti-LGBTQ sentiments, anti-homosexuality, if you will, and similar, religious freedom. Read that, small government, because big government is a threat to your personal liberties. So all of that was offered, provided that we first gave our endorsement
Mhm.
religiously. In other words, to kind of sacralize, to make sacred the Republican Party,
Mm.
to make it an agency of God on the earth. And and we cooperated with that in our language, in mobilizing our people, in eventually campaigning for and providing even support personnel for campaigns, eventually for people who were elected or appointed to office. So all of this became part of a kind of partnership between church and state,
And does
and both
that,
sides benefited.
sorry, sorry, say that last line.
Both sides benefited from that
Mm.
arrangement.
But that also requires like a bit of blinders of, you know, knowing that this is against God's worldview and that this is not, um, you know, he's right. Are you doing a disservice to the actual things you believe in by making this pact?
Well, you certainly have to shuffle a lot of theological cards. It becomes kind of, oh, what do you call those games, where you confuse the viewer, you've got,
Like the cup trick.
yeah, exactly. Where's the coin? Where's the jelly bean? Whatever. And you have to do a lot of mind bending and justification, self justification. You have to come up with some really clever formulations like, well, if we didn't do that, then this might happen.
Mm.
And just as I would later employ, and I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say this, but I will and I must and I do often now. I would use the trick of fear and anger to mobilize people, to raise money, and so forth. And it was used on me. So if you don't do this, if you don't get behind this Republican candidate, then you will be fostering an anti Christian, even satanic agenda.
Mm.
And the term that was often used was the blood of the innocents will be on your hands. Well, that's a lot to go to bed with at night. When that message is being transferred to someone like me, I was young, I was in my 20s when I was introduced to the religious right movement. I was in my late 20s. And to have my elders, the doyens in the room, the venerable leaders in the church world saying, if you don't do this, you will not only fail God, you will be helping the devil
Mm.
to destroy the world, to destroy people, to destroy human life. So that was what was being reinforced and churning around, and eventually it kind of wears you down. And I just sort of, uh, you know, acquiesced.
So it sounds like there's an immersion where you're so immersed in that you can't get outside of yourself to see that from a different perspective. Um, that almost cult-like atmosphere that we're seeing now. And I think there's a lot of parallels to what you're describing, and I think where we are as a country now. Um, is that fair to say?
Yes, sadly, I think it is fair to say. In fact, parallels with other times and places. It's one of the reasons, well, actually, I don't want to fast forward the story, but what led me to a different experience was looking at the parallels, for example, of what occurred in 1930s Germany during the rise of Hitler, Nazism, and the Nazification of the Evangelische Kirche, the Evangelical Church of
Mm,
Germany, which embraced Adolf Hitler as a gift and miracle from God.
hmm,
That was the term that was used. And so there are parallels there. There are other parallels. Certainly, you alluded to cults. There's cultish behavior. And yes, in a way, especially when you make your living, you're utterly dependent, as I was. The only way I could provide for my family, my wife and my children, was to do this work.
hmm.
And if I failed to do that, I would be kicked out. I'd be ostracized. I would be fired, lose uh, my income, and that's very frightening. So there was fear on a lot of levels used as a method to dominate and control, and I experienced that personally. And then, as I've said, and I do a lot of penance these days, if I can use that term, to make up for using it on others.
And that's, and thank you for saying that. I think that that lends to the transition that I think is necessary to the story of how you use that, specifically in the fight against abortion in the 90s and what happened at the tragic murder of the doctor at the clinic. Um, I don't want to bring up relics of the past, but I do think it's important to the story. And I also think, in a way, you were allowed to have kind of a second chance at your life's mission after that, as being indirectly associated with a murder as opposed to being the murderer. But knowing you had influence in that situation, right? So I think you're going to obviously live with that scar forever, and I'm thankful that you are open about it, right? That you're willing to tell your role in that. But I also think that gave you an opportunity to reevaluate your influence and how you can perhaps use your influence in a different way. So, can you just talk about that period in life for a little bit so people have context?
Yeah, well, I had just returned in 1988 from a cross-country walk. I walked from Canada to Mexico to raise money and awareness of clinics and schools for some of the poorest children in this hemisphere.
Was that the faith walk, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that something you pioneered, or was that a traditional
Yeah,
method of?
yeah. Yeah, I stumbled on the situation. I had gone down to Mexico City to preach in one of the largest evangelical churches in the world, El Centro de Fe, Esperanza y Amor in Mexico City, the Center of Faith, Hope, and Love. That's the subtitle of my memoir,
Mhm.
Faith, Hope, and Love. It's been a theme that I've returned back to. But back then, when I was in Mexico City, I saw the plight of these people living in, on, and off the massive refuse dumps in and around Mexico City. I came back, I put into motion this project. I walked, raised a lot of money, recruited a lot of volunteers to go to Mexico. And while I was on that 4-month trek through the United States to Mexico, my brother, my identical twin brother, who was also a pastor, was arrested for demonstrations, anti-abortion demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention in Atlanta that year. And I was shocked. I had no idea he was engaged in that work. I didn't like it. When I got back home, he said, just come with me to one of these abortion clinics. We're going to blockade the doors. You'll see what beautiful work this is. And I went, I was hooked from that moment. I was convinced that unborn, preborn children, the fetus in the womb, was a human being and deserved to be protected. I wasn't cynical about that. I truly believed that passionately. And I thought I was joining an entirely peaceful movement, and it was. It was at the, well, that deserves some further examination. But on the surface, it appeared to be a nonviolent movement engaging in civil disobedience. What I realized after years of being involved in that work, many years, was that the rhetoric, the language that we employed over time, we went from celebrating life in the womb as the kind of language we would use to very menacing, very threatening language, depersonalizing the individuals who provided abortion services, physicians who performed abortions, and even the women seeking reproductive health services who were coming to these clinics. And so the name calling, using terminology like murderers, baby killers, and so on, asking mothers, why are you going to kill your child? And over time, that makes the target of that language a perpetrator of unspeakable crimes. So now you get people who think, well, if the police and prosecutors and legislators won't do anything about this, then I need to do something about it. And I was sure during those years, now we're talking about the 1990s, that no one in our movement would ever consider an act of violence. We would use violent words, but never did I think that would translate into action. And in fact, individuals in our movement started shooting doctors. And one that I had had face-to-face encounters with numerous times, Barnett Slepian, in Buffalo, New York. And it was enough to jar me and to force me to look critically at what we were doing, but not enough to remove me from the movement. So what I realized through that experience much later on was that language is itself a weapon.
Yes.
And it can be a very dangerous, lethal weapon. Because what it does is it constructs a fictional world in which killing the target of that language, as happened in Nazi Germany, as has happened in many other places, suddenly that's no longer an immoral, unethical, or criminal act. It is, in fact, a justifiable and even virtuous act. And that's what happened in the movement while I was a leader of it. Mm-hmm. And now I realize the way I contributed to that was the language, the posture, the disposition, all of it. And I realize now, and I live with great regret that I didn't stop and reverse that when I could have.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I don't envy that situation. And I think, like I said, I think you do have to own that, and you do. I'm kind of blown away of how hard it is to actually see it while you're in it. And I'm kind of fascinated with this in other aspects, of society, but in this particular situation, coming from this peaceful part of Christianity and walking from Canada to Mexico and feeling love and faith and hope, um, to then almost instantly get swept up in this dynamic feeling, right? I think that that same seduction you talked about when you talked about Reagan, seems very similar here, right? You're drawn into this thing, and then those violent, hateful words that are being used are going against the very thing that you're saying you stand for. And I think that's what's hard. And we'll get into this a little later, but I think that's hard for younger people as well to try to come to grips with getting back to the church and getting back to a place of organized religion, and not just spirituality, because I think they see that contradiction and can't make sense of it. Um, so again, the fact that you're able to come out of that and see that now of language in itself being a weapon, I think is very important. And this is also, and I'm sure you experience this, right? This whole cancel culture, and that people are like, ah, you're a snowflake, and they're just words, and he's just joking, and minimizing the impact those words have on the other person, on the recipient of that verbal violence. Um, I see that a lot. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and which you're very familiar with because you were in New Britain at one point, and I was a town over in Southington. Um, but I think there's a lot of towns that's just a symbol of where, um, because your town looks a certain way and there's not much diversity in it, it's very comfortable and it's very normalized to think or say certain things. It's not until you realize the perspective of someone outside of that and what that meant for them and what that did to their life. So, and I think we are seeing that blown up now because everybody's online, and we see it in real time all over the place. And that's a hard thing to deal with. So I do think your ability to come out now, uh, in your role as a minister, but just as a human who lived through this, who can now tell the story of like, don't go down that road. I guess what I am long-windedly getting to is the question of, how do you prevent someone who might be in a similar situation to you, who you can see clear signs are going to go down that path? How do you prevent someone from going down that path?
One is by truth telling, and that's harder than it sounds. It seems like one of the default mechanisms that we humans sometimes go to is creating non reality in our own minds
Mm.
because it's easier to navigate through a fictitious world that we construct ourselves. After all, if we build it and design it and operate it, then we can kind of predict how it's going to go. Well, real life isn't like that. It's very unpredictable. And again, my posthumous spiritual companion, this guy, Dietrich uh, Bonhoeffer, or Bonhoeffer, depending on where you are, said he was very big on reality,
Mm.
staying tied to reality. I would later have to learn this through therapy, through
Mhm.
working with a therapist, how you stay connected to the real world and real people, not the world as we fear it is, as we wish it were, but the world and human beings the way they really are and who they really are and what they really are. And that's important. And sometimes it just comes through, caring enough to actually help somebody to connect with
Yeah.
reality. Is that the way it really is? Was that the way it really played out? Um, that that doesn't sound to me the way I understand it or I saw it. And helping people to stay connected to the real world. I think we're seeing this played out on the national stage in a spectacular way now with national leaders who create fictional worlds and then try to take us to those worlds. So I think that's part of it. The other is appealing to the best in people. And I do that a lot on social media, especially on my Facebook page, where I have lots of opponents these days, people who see the world very differently from me. but I try to treat them with understanding. I go way back in time to my early formation as a minister, when a beautiful soul named Doug Louie, Chinese American psychologist and minister, who said to me, Rob, you'll always do better if you remember that it's not what people say or do that matters as much as why they say and do it. Look for the motive and connect with that.
Yep.
It's really been helpful to me at this stage of my
It's
life in understanding myself and in understanding others.
yeah, that's the harder work, in my opinion. I think to be able to say he said something, I'm offended, you know, and that's it, and stop it there, as opposed to like, well, what's motivating this person to say this thing? What's behind it? And I do think, to your point, like, I think we're all hurting and healing uh, in our own ways, and certain things that happen in our own lives. So I think there has to be a certain sensitivity and empathy towards others at all times. So I do think that's a good lesson. You've brought up a couple things in your answer too that I want to kind of touch on. Is um, you know, I grew up Catholic and I left the church young. And a lot of it was because of some of the contradictions we talked about. And there's um, other stuff I couldn't grapple with. I think humanity, to a certain extent, feels this need to have a higher power because they're not able to deal with that reality. I think reality is very hard to face. So if I'm to be a cynic for a second, doesn't religion and organized religion in the cloak of that complicate it and make that harder to see the reality, because there's so much that's not tangible that you can't touch? And it's a question I have because I think I've turned to, like, this might sound like a hippie, but I've turned towards the environment as my deity, right? Of just like getting into nature as often as possible, realizing this is so much bigger than me, and respecting that and understanding that, like, I am just a small piece of this bigger picture. To me, that feels church-like, right? Because I can see it, I can feel it, smell it. Um, so can you talk about that a little bit, about that need to have a higher power, and how do you feel religion complicates that?
Yes, absolutely does. And that's why I think religion can be a very beautiful, very generous, very positive force, or it can be a terribly negative, very harmful, very destructive force.
Mm.
It's what I think makes religion important, but it can be the ruin
And,
of a lot of things.
and you are still a minister, correct?
I am, and still very much a believer in God.
Hmm.
I will say I appreciate uh, the physical world in a way I did not during most of my ministerial career and during most of my uh, religious journey, but I do now. There's a beautiful Bible verse that says the heavens or the universe declares the glory of God, and the earth God's handiwork. So there's a lot to say about the physical world. Very, very important. And I think actually uh, reflects the divine in many ways. There's also a lot of good to say about atheists, by the way. This guy, Bonhoeffer, said the atheist is the greatest gift to a Christian
Wow.
because the atheist will help a Christian see uh, their faith in a way no one else can.
See, I knew we'd get along.
So there we go. Partnership. It's a wonderful partnership. And I say every believer is an atheist at some point in the day. There's a moment in time you're filled with doubt. You behave as if, there is no divine. And you appreciate the world in that sense. And I think that's a really careful balance because The other thing that Bonhoeffer, and I know I talk about him too much, my wife Cheryl often says to me, honey, enough on Bonhoeffer, you're boring everybody. so, and,
Not at
and,
all.
but he's a brilliant mind. He was, I think, one of the most brilliant minds of the last 150 years. And Bonhoeffer said that, um, you know, in appreciating God, you have to appreciate humanity on the same plane, because in Christian belief, anyway, we believe that God came to us in the human person of Jesus.
Hmm.
And it was Jesus who said the two most important commandments that God has ever given to humankind is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And he said the second is the equivalent to it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Nothing is more important than these two. So humanity becomes as important to us as God. But he also warned that Christians are given to flights of fancy, that we go to these imaginary worlds and imaginary places, which puts us at a distance from humanity. It separates us from human beings.
Yeah.
And that's when religion becomes toxic.
Yeah. That's it's interesting to hear that coming from someone within. I think it's easy to have that conversation with an atheist. It's another thing to hear that coming from a minister who believes in God and has dedicated their life to that. So I appreciate that honesty. Um, I do want to move past the past, but uh, just to kind of cap that off, I'm interested in what remains in the past and where is the carryover, right? I think there's former associations with Roy Moore. There's the abortion stuff. There's, some of the things that, you may or may not be proud of that you are associated with. How much of that is a part of your life today? Are you still doing work against abortion? Like where do you stand now when it comes to some of those relics of the past?
Well, short answer is no. I'm not doing anti-abortion work anymore. I see abortion very differently. I'll be candid with you. I don't celebrate abortion, but neither have I ever experienced abortion, nor will I ever. In that sense, I mean, personally,
Hmm.
first person, um, I will never need to think about abortion. I will never feel threatened in that sense. So, in many ways, I've taken a position now where I sit and I listen. I listen to people who are in the first person experience, who have considered abortion, have had abortions, experienced abortion, have been terribly afraid in an unplanned pregnancy, an unwelcome pregnancy. I listen very, very deeply to their human experience. And so I react very differently to that now. I've also come out very publicly in an essay in the New York Times supporting Roe v. Wade. I worked for 25 years to reverse Roe v. Wade, either by legislation or at the court. I spent a lot of years, 10 years, working face to face with Supreme Court justices at the Supreme Court. And so, that was a big, big shift for me. It took many years for me to get to that place, to see why Roe v. Wade is so important for women, particularly women in certain circumstances, poor women in particular, because whether Roe is reversed at some point or not, upper middle class and upper class people will always be able to get abortion. They'll be able to get on a plane and fly somewhere to have an abortion, but poor women can't. So all of that, that's I've left all that in the past. The other thing I've left in the past is my work against same-sex marriage and other rights for persons of different sexual identities than my own. Um, I'm kind of hopelessly heterosexual, though, I've had a bromance or two.
One in back of you right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, and, uh, and there's even a scholar who believes that Bonhoeffer was a closeted gay man
Hmm.
and has very good evidence for that. Um, but all that simply to say, I left all that behind. I actually sat with uh, Jim Obergefell, for whom the same-sex marriage case at the Supreme Court is named. I'm going to call it providentially. I was seated next to him in the courtroom during the arguments
Hmm.
for and against same-sex marriage. I heard his story of his love for his partner and husband, who by that time had died. Uh, I believe of cancer. I'm trying to remember. But in any case, the story he told was deeply, deeply moving and affected me very deeply. But there was a whole confluence of things that led up to a very big change for me. And I now support same sex marriage. I do everything I can to support individuals with different sexual identities than my own. All that. And yet at the same time, I have to say that the relationships I had during those years, I've done everything possible to preserve them. Friendships are very important to me. I have very deep and long friendships with people. One of them who works very close to Donald Trump, and I spend just about every day of my life now trying to counter Trump's message, both to evangelicals and to the world and to the country. I'm working for his defeat come November, and yet I have friends who work for him and assist him.
Hmm.
And I've tried to preserve those friendships in spite of those considerable hurdles. So, and my faith in God. I think I have a clearer understanding of who Jesus was than I ever have in my life. I'll never completely understand Jesus, but I think I have a better understanding of Jesus and what he stood for and what he was about, uh, the importance of love as the key to understanding my faith and understanding the nature of God. One of the verses that evangelicals grow up reciting is 1 John 4, 7, and 8. We learn it first as children, and we sing it. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not, knoweth not God, for God is love. Beloved, let us love one another. 1 John 4, 7, and 8. Kids sing that in every evangelical church in America. And then we forget what it means to love another person and how selfless love is and how welcoming and embracing and expansive love is. I certainly forgot that. Love became very, very narrow for me.
Yeah.
Now it's opened very, very wide.
I'm glad to hear that. You touched on a lot of kind of why we started Common Ally and what it means to have allies across the aisle, whether that's within our family unit or politically or professionally or whatever that is. Um, we don't, and you and I have talked about this in the past. Like, you can't cancel people out of your lives, especially when they're in your family and when you respect them and love them, regardless of their affiliation. And I think that's also how you actually achieve um, co-brokered change. Like, you have to be at least understanding and in close contact with people on the quote unquote other side, or if you really want to see a better future for both of you. So, and I know that's not easy as well, but um, I want to kind of selfishly ask the question of, what does it mean to you to be a common ally?
Hmm. Hmm. You know, when I first saw that moniker, I really loved it because allies don't always hold to the same worldview, the same philosophy, the same social structure. I mean, if you kind of think of it on the macro, countries are allies with one another, and sometimes they are very, very different culturally, economically, governmentally, all of it. They can be very, very different, but they find one common interest that they will both benefit from each other's support and participation in.
Yeah.
I think we can bring that down to the micro. That's certainly true in families. It's true in my family. Uh, I think it's true in every church, for example. Um, and we often, in the evangelical tradition, we will refer to churches, congregations, as families of God. We use that term. We say, oh, you're part of the family. You're part of the family of God. We're the family of God. My brothers, my sisters, my mothers and fathers in the faith, children in the
Hmm.
faith. We talk in these terms. We're family. And families can be allies with one another, even though they hold to different political opinions, um, different tastes in everything from music to food to clothing, different lifestyles, all of that. I think some of the most beautiful people I've met in my world are LGBTQ persons who remain very loving and generous towards family members who oppose their lifestyles, their life choices,
Mm.
their sexual identities. And yet they'll tell me, I love my family and I'm loyal to my family. You told me a similar, I hope I'm not talking out of turn here, but off the recording, you told me a beautiful story of your own love for your family across divides. I think that's the greatest test is when it's a very, very personal thing. I think it's easier for us to do that in less personal spaces. So when I heard that, I thought, wow, there's real room for that. Sometimes, we can probe and someone who appears to have nothing in common with us, we'll get to something somewhere. I mean, even, anti-gay activists, I'll kind of push these days, push them a little bit to a point where they'll tell me what it is that drives them. And some will say, I just care about my kids and I don't want them to embrace that lifestyle. And I say, I care about my kids too. And I know gay parents who care passionately about their kids. They love their kids like you love your kids. We all love our kids. And sometimes they'll allow for that. And they'll say, I guess that's true. I guess that's right. I guess so. So you can find something somewhere. And maybe that's a key,
Yeah.
you know, that'll get us through a certain door that we couldn't get through if we just kind of wrote it off and said, no way, can't happen, nothing here. Uh, I'm not sure.
Well, I like your definition. I think that gels very well with how we see ourselves as well. Uh, and it's something, we also talked about this before, but it's something I've dedicated my entire life to. And um, I have a child. I have a 5-year-old. I have a biracial daughter who is the light of my life, and you know, I'm following her lead. So I can't imagine me pushing something on her in a certain way that she should be, right? Because I think I would see that light go out and who she is disappear. And I've seen that too often with friends who were in that situation where their family did not accept what they were, how they lived, and it's hurt them and will live with them forever. So, part of I think what you're also mentioning first of all, finding that kernel of common ground to start with and then expand from there is very much how CommonAlly began. I think a lot of the work you do is centered around that as well. Um, but I'm also a firm believer in environment. To the example you just said, like when you can talk to anti-gay activists and just have a conversation and find that human element behind them when they're like, yeah, I could see that. If they had that as a daily dose in their social diet, um, I feel like there's more conversion there. And I'm not trying to convert someone away from their beliefs, right? I want to be very clear about that. But when it's at someone else's expense, I do take issue with that. Um, and I think that if someone is exposed to something long enough, they form empathy, they form understanding, and they evolve, right? I don't think they're changing as much as they are evolving, learning, and then moving on. Like, I think that is how we should all go through life. That's just my personal belief. Um, and that kind of begs another question I want to ask, kind of in the abortion argument, and then I want to kind of shift to a couple more things. I know we're getting close to time here, but um, is it possible to be anti-abortion and not push for legislation against it, not push for your neighbor to not have one? This is my issue, right? And I have to kind of detach myself from CommonAlly a bit because I don't want to do a disservice to our important mission. But I also want people to understand I'm a human being with conflicting emotions as well. And I understand the argument of wanting to preserve life. Um, I happen to want to preserve life all the way through that life cycle. But I have friends who have gone down that road, and it was not an easy decision. And some people don't have the luxuries of having an option, right? And I think that's a deeply personal thing that is not my business. So while I may be, anti-abortion, I have no right to put that on someone else. So that's a hypothetical, but I am giving you the question of, is it possible to not force this on people and still feel good about your decision to be anti-abortion?
Yes. The short answer, yes, although it took me 10 years to come to that conclusion.
Mm.
That was a very difficult decade of reflection, listening, feeling, empathizing, trying my best to get as close to an individual as I could in terms of living that experience. Yes, and in fact, as we've seen repeated throughout human history, whenever we try to enforce moral concepts
Mm-hmm.
with the power of the state, first of all, it's always abused by the state. I'm going to say 100% of the time.
Yep.
Maybe an historian or two might challenge me and get it down to 98.7% of the time, but it's pretty close to 100%, I would say. Because, the coercive power of the state is too easy of a mechanism of control. And I think we have to bridle that very, very carefully. And secondly, there's even a Christian rationale for this, because when Jesus encountered, for example, there's a story in the Gospels of Jesus encountering a woman accused of adultery, and adultery in Bible times was carried the death penalty. It was a capital crime. That's what I was trying to think of. Capital crime. It was a capital offense.
Mm-hmm.
And, she was in a position where she had been accused, found guilty, and now men were prepared to stone her to death. And Jesus stepped in and said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And they all left. And he was left with this woman. And he said, "Woman, I don't condemn you." And so, what I've said to my fellow evangelicals is in working to criminalize abortion, what you are doing is you are replaying that incident in the Gospels where this woman, you're making a moral judgment. They made it a criminal judgment.
Mm-hmm.
and brought criminal penalties, the worst kind. And Jesus uh, opposed that and, in fact, released her from that situation. And that's what we're called to do. So even if you believe that this is supremely immoral, for the Christian, the answer is not criminalizing and using the coercive force of the state to punish that. It's a matter of conscience. A person answers for that before God, and they have to be free to do that.
Hmm.
We're free to do that. And I know we don't have time. I'm looking at the clock too. Go
I'm
into,
actually fine. It's up to you.
well, I don't want to get preachy here. This isn't the place. This isn't church, and I know this isn't the pulpit. So I want to be careful. But at the same time, where my mind goes as a Christian, as an evangelical, as a minister, is that when we do that, when we borrow the power of the state to enforce our moral code, what we're actually being unfaithful to God.
Yeah.
We're choosing an earthly God to replace the God before whom all of us answer. And I remind the male leadership of my church, which is the dominant leadership. We have very few women, I'm sorry to say. But that wasn't always true. Evangelicals were one of the first, in fact, we were the first religious body in the United States to ordain women way back in the 1800s. Then we got away from that, and that's part of the failed arc of American evangelicalism. But in any case, Jesus said, anyone who looks at a person and another person and lusts after them is guilty of adultery. Everybody who hates another human being in their heart is guilty of murder. That makes me a murderer, and I'm going to admit right here on your platform, it also makes me an adulterer. So,
This has turned into a confessional booth. I love it.
thank you, Father. Thank you, Father
I
God.
never thought I'd be on that side of it, but I'll take it.
Well, you create a very safe place for it. Thank you, Aaron.
Great.
Which means if anybody's going to be stoned, stone me first.
Hmm.
And so it reminds us we are all violators. Don't think you're any better, holier than anyone else. You deserve the same penalties as anybody else on earth, as well as the same goodness as anyone else on earth. We are all the same, part of the same human family, cut from the same human cord. And that to me is the message of the gospel.
Hmm.
And I lost sight of that for 30 years of my life.
What scares me on that is you were so powerful and influential and such an integral role on creating this machine that is now in place, that is more powerful and bigger, going down this road that you've departed. Right. So I know that your work now is to reverse that and to help change some of the damage that's been done. But is it even possible? Right. I think about, just being brown skinned in this country, being a Muslim American, believing any other religion other than Christianity, um, is a very tough thing in our world today. And I think a lot of that is due to the work that's been done from the evangelical movement since Reagan on. So what does that look like to you? Like how much work is that? Um,
A lot.
yeah.
It's a lot of work. It's very hard work. It can be very discouraging work. And I am going to spend the rest of my life dismantling a lot of what I helped construct. But what makes me optimistic is when I look at the generation of, say, 45 and younger, even within evangelicalism. When you poll evangelical pastors in their 30s and 40s, you find a very different list of opinions on
Mhm.
everything from gay rights to same sex marriage to abortion to politics. I know an awful lot of young evangelical pastors who support uh, Bernie. They were part of Bernie's movement and still are, still support much more progressive political ideas.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very different situation with younger church, and that goes even more so for younger people in the pews of evangelical churches, if they're there anymore.
Yeah.
Of course, we've lost millions of them, and
Yeah.
that's very.
And that's something I also wanted to touch on. I don't know how deep we can go on it, but um, the mass exodus of young people from religion and Gen Z and millennials kind of being grossly absent in the pews. What's your case to be made for them? I think of this. We obviously work with Gen Z a lot. This is the digital native culture who grew up with a device in their hand, who are very well accustomed to lockdown drills, who have been gunned down in their own schools, who have watched leadership abdicate their role as leaders and role models. They've watched government corruption. They've watched their environment go away. Um, I don't know. When I was younger, I didn't feel the weight of that at that age, and I feel like they are carrying that burden. So, how do you make a case for them to come back?
Well, first of all, on their own terms.
Hmm.
Um, Here I go again. This guy, Bonhoeffer, said that the future was a religionless Christianity outside of the formal church, outside of the buildings, the structures, the hierarchies, the behavioral codes, even the statements of belief. That spirituality is a very organic, natural disposition for human beings. So, you know, Jesus didn't found a church. He didn't preach in a church. Uh, he ministered to people where they were, wherever they were, and mostly in the open air. And just in the natural course of life, at the well, there's a famous story of his encounter with a woman at a well. He broke with social convention. In those times, men did not speak to women other than members of their own family, and he broke that convention. So outside even social convention, I think people pursue God, spirituality, the divine on their own terms. And, ministers like me, churches need to receive people on their own terms. Maybe they don't want to come every Sunday. Maybe they want to come once in a while. Maybe they never want to come to the church. They just want to know some of the people in the church and talk about spirituality and go through some spiritual exercises. And, I think we're going to be freer. One of the things that church structures do and religious institutions do is they devolve into kind of, again, controlling and dominating people. And that's anti-spiritual. That
Yeah.
actually takes us away from spirituality. And so, to me, that's one of the cases I would make is if you are a spiritual person and you feel spiritual inclinations, pursue them on your own terms, where they lead you. Christians like me shouldn't be afraid of that because one of the promises we have from God, who says, and we have this in the Bible, um, you will seek for me and you will find me when you seek for me with your whole heart. Just seek the divine spirituality with your heart.
Hmm.
That's my message today. It's not more complicated than that.
It's a good one. No, I think we have a tendency to overcomplicate when not necessary. So I appreciate that. Um, okay, couple more questions, and then
I'm enjoying this too much. It's
me.
like, wow, we could go on forever. I'm enjoying your company.
Likewise, I
So,
really enjoy this, and I've probably said this too much during this whole series, but I like being on the other side of the camera. I like being in the sausage making and not on the other end when someone's filming you eat it. This is not my normal habitat, but I have grown to really love this process because one of the things I do love is conversation and connection and understanding people and also forcing myself to really get into worlds that I'm I've been wholly absent from. So to me, I'm thoroughly enjoying this, and I really do appreciate you taking all of this time with me. Um, One of the things I kind of want to understand, and I think you've alluded to some of this, but where does the clergy like have a responsibility to stopping inequalities and inequities and injustice and violence that we're dealing with as a society and that is coming to a head, with the BLM movement and George Floyd and everything's that's now unfortunately later than it should have been exposed for how racially dominant the history of this country has been. What's the role of the church in that?
Well, first of all, I think it's one of our supreme responsibilities. Um, we even have a verse in the New Testament, in the book of James, in the Bible, that says, if you say to someone, "God bless you, be warmed and filled," and you do not provide for them what they need, food, clothing, shelter, how does the love of God dwell in you?
Mm,
Um, and it's a rhetorical question because the answer is it doesn't.
yeah.
And in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the story of a king who brought before him all the people of the earth, and separates them out, the sheep from the goats. One gets eternal, uh, life, the other eternal judgment. And then he goes through this exercise. What is the cause for separation? And the faith each receives. How they treated the least of these. When I came to you hungry, you did not give me food. When I came to you naked, you did not give me clothing. When I was in prison, you did not come to visit me. And this is what distinguishes, I guess to oversimplify it, because it isn't quite that simple, but the good from the bad. If you take care of others, including intervening to stop their suffering, if you have the power to do it. If it's in the power, in fact, we have another Bible verse. If it's in the power of your hand to do good, do it, and do not hold back. So we were talking earlier, it's one thing to sit down with somebody who, um, you know, feels homosexuality is immoral and homosexual persons are immoral and so on. It's one thing for them to hold that feeling inside of them, but when they express it in a way that's oppressive and injurious, harmful, that we're obligated to stop. We stop the injury and the harm. Bonhoeffer said there comes a time when the car is careening out of control and threatening the people walking along the roadside, and you must thrust a bar into the wheel
Mm,
and bring the car to a halt. That's your obligation to do that. Then you can figure out what's going on with the driver, but first stop the car.
yeah.
That's how I think about legislation, public policy, even social practices, the behavior of the church. There comes a time where it has to stop. The suffering must stop, and whatever it takes to stop it, peacefully, non-violently, but with intervention if necessary, whatever it takes, you stop that. I guess that's a carryover from my old world as an activist, even a pro-life,
Yeah.
anti-abortion activist. We used to say, you have to stop, intervene, use your own body, but do so non-violently. That would change over time, sadly, in the movement. But, that was certainly the legacy of John Lewis.
Hmm.
We just said goodbye to here in Washington, D.C.
And
Uh,
you went, right?
I did. Yes, I did. I had met him. He had hugged me once. I'll never forget that. He knew at the time, I was a conservative, Republican, religious right activist. He knew exactly who I was. And He embraced me and hugged me deeply. Man, I'll never forget that hug. It left an impression on my soul, and it has helped me make this journey. But he was one who said, you have to, he used that term, you have to get into good trouble.
Hmm.
So that's the obligation, I believe, of every member of the clergy, every minister, is to act on behalf of the least, those who are powerless, who are in the margins, and loan them our power.
Yeah.
Clergy are influential still in our society, notwithstanding the shifts and changes in opinions about religion. We still carry a lot of influence, and we need to use that to help others and relieve their suffering.
I think the documentary Armor of Light, which you were the subject of, which won an Emmy, I watched that the other day, and it's really powerful, and it sheds light on the kind of battle to fight this while you are within. You see some of that in the exchanges, and a lot of this is around. I don't want to ruin it. I want people to go and see this movie, um, but a lot of this is around Second Amendment debate and about gun ownership and gun violence and everything that goes with that debate, which is obviously we will need a whole episode just for that. Uh, but I think that that's also profound work, and I'm glad that you're in that space. Um, I do want to give a little time to Costly Grace, your book, and what that means to you, and why people should read it. I want to just hear from you that, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up after that. But I definitely want another interview if you're willing.
Of course, thank you. I'm honored by that and a little embarrassed. I know I get a little loquacious, so sorry for a lot of words.
No, no.
Yeah, well, it's a memoir, and it tells this story, at least up until roughly 2016. And I've come a long way since then, even. I stopped writing, I guess it was a little after that, maybe early 2017, but a lot has happened since then, as we all know, but
Hmm.
including with me personally. But it is the story, the full arc. And what progressive and liberal folks have told me is that it's a very, very hard book for them to read for the first third or even half of the story because it's how I descended into a very dark place. And I was painfully honest about it. In fact, my editor at HarperCollins, Luke Dempsey, great editor, uh, when I turned in the first manuscript, he said to me, this is a very nice story, but we're not going to publish it. And I said, well, why not? You asked me for the book. I didn't ask you for the book. And he said, it's not an honest story. I don't know what that is. Maybe.
That's God. Um,
Sorry, I don't know where that's coming from. The book is the arc, the story. Um, I think in telling a very raw and honest story, which my editor pushed me to do, um, he said, write until it's painful, until it's embarrassing, until you know you're feeling it deeply, and when you feel it, your readers will feel it. And that was wonderful advice
yeah.
because it became a therapeutic experience for me. I was able to grow through that experience. I was able to face myself in a way I had never faced myself, not even with a therapist, not even in psychotherapy, uh, not in the confessional booth, if you will, though evangelicals don't have those, but we have the equivalent to it. Um, so, I told a painful story. In the end, my editors would cut out 30,000 words, a lot of words. But it was just in the writing of it. The exercise was very good for me personally, and I hope for my readers. I think it starts on a positive note. It descends into a very dark place, but at the end, I write about what I call my third conversion, which really started in the basement of a seminary where I was doing my doctoral work late in life in my 50s. And I was comparing what happened in Germany in the 1930s and what was happening now in America at this time. And there were so many parallels. It was stunning to me. I'd been in a room when Donald Trump was first introduced to evangelical leaders from all over the United States. It was at somebody's birthday party. And I write about that in the book. And I was there with my colleagues and friends and people I had worked with and known and collaborated with over decades. And I saw him essentially do an audition for our political support. I was turned off by that. I was repulsed by it, but many of my friends came to embrace Trump. And I write about that. Part of my awakening was to see what he was doing, exploiting that room, mesmerizing those people, selling them a bill of goods, and watching my friends, my colleagues, fall for it. So I write about that. But in the very end, I write about my return to a Passover table at the home of a rabbi. He and I had been opponents. He worked for women's reproductive rights and choice. I had worked against that. We were on opposite sides of the fence. Now I was at his table. And that would lead to a final moment of decision for me that would take me on a very different road and lead me to dismantle the organization that I had built over a 30-year period, walk away from 50,000 financial donors, very big budget, a building on Capitol Hill across the street from the Supreme Court, a block from the Capitol, 10 minutes from the White House. I walked away from all of that, left it, to start a new venture in faith with nothing, with zero. So I think the book ends on a hopeful note, because if someone like me can change, can see the light, and start working for the betterment of this world, I would say, I was pretty far gone. So don't give up hope. People can change, even late in life, even from, a very, very far place they can travel. Let's not give up on human beings. I guess in that way it makes me, for years I decried humanists. They were the enemies of humankind. Enemies of God. Now I would call myself a consummate humanist.
Thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm glad we connected. I'm glad you came on. And thank you again.
Thank you, Aaron. And I can't wait to see the Avatar.